The candle was still burning. Jeremiah Hawkins stood at the edge of the property line, his boots rooted to the cracked earth, staring up at the second-floor window of the Donnelly Ranch house with the kind of dread that hollows a man from the inside out. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since Caroline Donnelly had ridden out of Redemption Creek with nothing but a saddlebag, a borrowed horse, and a secret she refused to share with anyone, least of all him. And every single night since she had gone, that small flame had flickered in the glass of her bedroom window, a silent sentinel against the darkness, a promise she had made to her father that she would keep herself lit up in his memory no matter how far the road took her. But her father was dead. Thomas Donnelly had been buried in the red clay soil behind the house just 4 days after Caroline left, taken by a fever that moved through him like wildfire through dry grass, fast and merciless, and without a single moment of warning. Jeremiah had been the one to hold the old man's hand at the end. He had been the one to close Thomas's eyes. He had been the one to tell the preacher and the neighbors and the hired hands, and he had done all of it with a steady jaw and a steady voice because someone had to. But he had not been the one to light Caroline's candle. That was the part that shattered him. That was the betrayal that cut straight down to bone. Because when he climbed those stairs and pushed open the door of her room on the 4th night after Thomas died, the candle had already been lit. Someone else had lit it. Someone who knew about the ritual, about the promise Caroline had made to her father before she left, about the quiet, secret language of light and window that passed between a daughter and the man who raised her alone in this brutal, gorgeous land. And the only person in Redemption Creek besides Jeremiah who knew about that candle was a man named Silas Webb. Jeremiah's jaw tightened until he could feel the pressure behind his back teeth. Silas Webb, who had been circling the Donnelly property for the better part of a year with the practiced patience of a vulture. Silas Webb, who had offered Thomas money for the east pasture 3 times and been refused 3 times. Silas Webb, who had smiled at Caroline with the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes and called her sweetheart in the street when she clearly did not want him to. Silas Webb, who had now apparently been inside Caroline's bedroom. The implications of that settled over Jeremiah like a cold iron weight, and then the anger followed, and then, underneath all of it, the thing he had been refusing to name for the better part of 2 years. Fear. Not fear of Silas Webb, though the man was dangerous in the way that quiet, calculating men are always more dangerous than loud ones. Not fear of the dark or the coming winter or the financial trouble that Thomas had been carrying privately for years. The fear that sat behind all those other fears, the oldest and most stubborn one, was simply this: that Caroline Donnelly had ridden away without knowing that Jeremiah Hawkins was in love with her. And now, with Thomas gone and Silas circling and the candle burning in the window for reasons he did not yet understand, he was terrified she might never come back. He had to find her. But first, he had to understand what the candle meant. He turned and walked back toward the ranch house, pushing through the front door with the kind of purposeful quiet that a man develops after years of working land that demands everything you have and gives back only what it decides you deserve. The house smelled of tobacco and cedar, and the faint ghost of the lavender water that Caroline kept on her washstand. It smelled of Thomas, too, that particular combination of old leather and pipe smoke, and something warm and human that grief had not yet fully erased. Margaret Holt, the woman who cooked for the ranch 3 days a week and had done so since before Caroline was born, was standing at the kitchen hearth stirring something that smelled like venison stew. She was 62 years old and built like a fence post, all wire and weather and practicality, and she looked at Jeremiah with the kind of expression that meant she had been waiting for him to come through that door. "You saw the candle," she said. "It was not a question." "I saw it," Jeremiah confirmed. He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down heavily, dropping his hat on the table beside him. "Who lit it, Margaret?" Margaret took her time answering. She set down her spoon and turned to face him with her arms folded across her chest, and her expression was complicated in the way that only older women who have watched younger people make avoidable mistakes can manage. "Caroline wrote me a letter," she said, "before she left. She wrote me a letter and told me that if her father passed while she was away, and that if she wasn't back yet, I was to light that candle for her every single night until she came home. She made me promise." Jeremiah processed this slowly. She knew Thomas was going to die. She suspected. She said the doctor had told him in private something about his heart, and that Thomas had refused to tell her because he didn't want her to cancel her trip. Margaret's voice softened just slightly at the edges. She was going to try to handle the business that took her away and get back before the end. She just didn't make it in time. The grief of that hit Jeremiah sideways, the way grief tends to when it's delayed by shock. Caroline had known. She had ridden out knowing her father was dying, carrying that knowledge alone because Thomas had made her carry it alone, and she had left a system in place to maintain the promise she'd made to him, because she had trusted that the system would hold even when she couldn't. She had trusted Margaret. She had not told Jeremiah. He turned that over carefully in his mind, looking for the betrayal he had expected to find, and instead found something more complicated and more painful. She hadn't told him because she hadn't known if she could trust him with something that fragile. They had worked the same land for 2 years, eaten at the same table, argued about cattle prices and fence lines and the proper way to read a coming storm, and in all that time, he had never once given her a clear enough signal that she could hand him the most tender and private part of herself and trust him not to drop it. That was on him. "When did she write this letter?" he asked. "About 3 weeks before she left. She wrote it and sealed it and gave it to me, and told me not to open it unless she was gone more than a week." Margaret returned to her stew, stirring with the slow authority of someone who has decided the best thing she can do for a grieving man is keep feeding him. "She also wrote a second letter. That one's for you." Jeremiah went very still. Margaret crossed to the small desk in the corner of the kitchen where Thomas had kept his accounts, opened the middle drawer, and produced an envelope with Jeremiah's name written on the outside in Caroline's precise, slightly forward-leaning handwriting. She set it on the table in front of him and went back to the stove without another word. He picked it up. The wax seal was a simple pressed circle with no marking on it. He broke it carefully, unfolded the single page inside, and read. The letter was dated 6 weeks ago, which meant she had written it before she even told Thomas she was leaving. It said, "Jeremiah, if you are reading this, then Margaret has decided you need to know. My father is sick, more seriously than he has let on to anyone, and I have to ride to Laramie to settle a debt that cannot wait. I cannot explain all of it here except to say that if I do not go, we will lose the ranch. Thomas does not know I found out about the debt. He has been trying to protect me from it the same way he has been trying to protect me from the truth about his health, and I have spent the last month watching him carry both of those burdens alone, and I cannot let him do it anymore. I am going to fix it. I am coming back. And when I come back, I need to ask you something important. I need to ask you if you would consider staying on at the Donnelly Ranch permanently, not as a hired hand, in a different capacity that I cannot quite put into words yet, but that I think you might understand if you think about it. Please keep the ranch running while I am gone. Please take care of my father if he needs it, and please do not let Selah's web anywhere near our property. I trust you with all of this, more than you know. Caroline." Jeremiah read it twice. Then he set it down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and stared at the grain of it for a long moment. In a different capacity that I cannot quite put into words yet, he thought he understood. He thought he might have understood for quite some time. He folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest, and stood up. "Margaret," he said, "what debt in Laramie? Do you know anything about it?" Margaret's stirring slowed. "I know Thomas borrowed money about 4 years back from a man named Creed Hollies. Borrowed it to keep the herd alive during the drought year. The terms were not friendly. From what I understand, Creed Hollies has been collecting interest ever since, and now he wants the full amount or he wants the land." "How much?" More than the ranch earns in 2 years. Jeremiah exhaled through his nose. And Caroline went to Laramie to negotiate with this man. That's what I believe. Alone. Margaret turned and looked at him with a kind of patient, devastating compassion. She didn't think she had anyone to go with her. Jeremiah picked up his hat. She does now. The ride to Laramie from Redemption Creek was 130 miles of open country, and Jeremiah Hawkins covered the first 40 of them before nightfall, pushing his bay gelding through the golden late afternoon light with the focused intensity of a man who has finally decided to stop waiting and start moving. The landscape rolled out around him in all its terrible beauty, the high plains of Wyoming in late September, the grass going amber and copper, and the sky a shade of blue so deep it looked like it might crack if you hit it right. Hawks circled above the ridge lines. The wind came from the northwest, carrying the first cold edge of the season it had not yet fully committed to. He made camp at a creek crossing he knew from a cattle drive 3 years back, hobbled his horse, built a small fire, and ate cold biscuits from his saddlebag while he looked up at the stars. He thought about Caroline in Laramie, sitting across a table from a man named Creed Hollies, who held the fate of the Donnelly ranch in one hand and his greed in the other. He thought about the way she held her chin when she was arguing a point she believed in, that slight upward tilt that looked like defiance but was really a kind of concentrated courage. He thought about the time she had climbed onto the roof of the barn during a hailstorm to tie down a section of roofing that was pulling loose, and how he had stood at the bottom of the ladder in an agony of helplessness, shouting instructions she was too focused to hear, and how she had come back down with her hair plastered to her face and her dress soaked, and a look of pure satisfaction in her dark eyes that had hit him somewhere in the chest like a fist. He had been in love with her since at least that moment. Probably longer. He fell asleep under a sky full of stars and dreamed of nothing, and in the morning he was back in the saddle before the sun cleared the horizon. He reached Laramie on the evening of the second day. Laramie in the fall of 1882 was a town that had survived its wildest years and was still in the process of deciding what it wanted to become. The Union Pacific had come through over a decade ago, and the railroad brought money and trouble in roughly equal proportions. The town had a courthouse now and a proper hotel and 3 churches and a school, but it also had 4 saloons and a jail that stayed busy, and a population that included a significant number of men who had come west to escape their histories. It was not a safe town exactly, but it was a real one, and it had the kind of rough texture that the frontier towns Jeremiah had known in his earlier years had been too temporary and too lawless to develop. He rode down the main street in the fading copper light, reading the signs on the storefronts, until he found the hotel Margaret had mentioned in a second conversation as he was saddling up to leave. He put his horse in the livery stable attached to the hotel, paid for oats and a stall, and went inside. The hotel clerk was a young man with a precise part in his hair and an expression of careful neutrality that suggested he had seen enough frontier drama to be neither surprised nor impressed by anything. Jeremiah asked, quietly and without particular emphasis, whether a Miss Caroline Donnelly was registered. The clerk consulted his ledger. Room 7, 2nd floor. Jeremiah climbed the stairs. The hallway smelled of tobacco smoke and boot leather and the particular dense heat of a building full of people. He stopped at the door marked with a tarnished brass 7, knocked twice and waited. A long pause. Then her voice, cautious and low, "Who is it?" "Jeremiah Hawkins." Another pause, shorter this time. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. She opened the door and looked at him, and in the half-second before either of them spoke, he had the chance to see her clearly and she had the chance to see him, and something in the air between them shifted in a way that was not quite like anything that had happened in their 2 years of daily proximity back at the ranch. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, dark green wool, and her dark hair was pinned up but loosely, the way it got toward the end of the day when the pins began to lose their grip. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and sustained worry, and her expression moved through surprise and relief and something raw and complicated that she covered quickly with the practical composure she always defaulted to. She was 25 years old and the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and he had been pretending not to notice for 2 years. "Jeremiah," she said, "how did you know where to find me?" "Margaret," he said simply. She stepped back and let him in, closing the door behind him and sliding the bolt closed again. The room was small and clean, with a brass bed and a washstand and a single window that looked out onto the back alley. On the windowsill was a short candle in a tin holder, half burned down. He looked at it. She saw him looking at it. "I brought one with me," she said, and her voice had gone quiet. "I lit it every night I was here, too, not just for him. It felt like if the flame was burning somewhere, the connection was still open, like the distance didn't matter quite so much." "Caroline," he said, "your father died 10 days ago." He watched her face. He watched the knowledge arrive, and he watched it break her, and he took the 2 steps necessary to close the distance between them and put his arms around her because there was nothing else in the world to do, and because he was done pretending that he didn't want to. She leaned against him for a long moment with both hands pressed flat against his chest, and she breathed, and she cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, the way people cry when they have been holding something back for so long that the release is almost physically painful. He held her and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say, and because sometimes the most honest thing you can offer a person is simply the fact of your presence. After a while she straightened. She crossed to the washstand and poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed her face, and when she turned back around she had reassembled the exterior of herself, though he could still see the grief in her eyes, and he knew she could see that he could see it. "He knew, didn't he?" she said. It was not really a question. "He knew," Jeremiah confirmed. "He went peacefully, he wasn't alone. Were you there?" "Yes." Something moved across her face that was partly grief and partly a deep, complicated gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for being with him." "He talked about you," Jeremiah said. "At the end. He said you were the best thing he ever did." She pressed her lips together. She nodded once. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the floor for a moment. And then she looked up at him with the direct, clear-eyed honesty that was one of the things he had loved about her from the very beginning. "How is the ranch?" she asked. "Standing. Herd is good. I hired 2 extra hands to cover while we're both gone." Sat down in the chair by the window, angling it to face her. "Margaret told me about the debt, about Creed Hollies." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I was handling it." "I know you were. I'm not here to take that away from you. I'm here because you shouldn't have to handle it alone." He paused, then said carefully, "I read the letter you left for me." The color in her cheeks shifted fractionally. "I wasn't sure if I should have left it." "I'm glad you did." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You said when you came back you needed to ask me something. I'd like you to ask it now." She looked at him steadily for a long moment. Then she said, with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed this and is now abandoning the rehearsed version in favor of the true one, "I would like to ask you if you would consider staying, not as a hired hand, as a partner, as eventually, if you were willing, as something more than a partner." She paused. "I realize that is a great deal to put on the table without having had a single proper conversation about any of it." Jeremiah looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Caroline, I rode 130 miles in 2 days specifically, because I couldn't stand the thought of you being in Laramie facing Creed Hollies alone. The only reason I didn't come sooner was that I didn't know where you were." She blinked. "Oh, I think that answers your question." A slow, uncertain smile broke across her face, the first real smile he had seen from her in this room, and it changed everything about the light in it. Then she seemed to remember something, and the smile retreated, and she straightened up and said, "There's a problem with Creed Hollies." Jeremiah settled back. "Tell me." She stood and crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of the room, opened the top drawer, and produced a document, several pages folded together and bound with a piece of string. She handed it to him, and he unfolded it and read. The document was a loan agreement between Thomas Donnelly and Creed Hollies, dated June 1878, drawn up by a notary in Cheyenne. The terms were, as Margaret had suggested, deeply unfriendly. The principal was $2,000, which was a significant sum in 1878, and a devastating one now with the accumulated interest that Hollies had been adding at a rate that was, in Jeremiah's reading, either legally questionable or outright predatory. The total amount now claimed as outstanding was $4,600, but it was the secondary clause at the bottom of the document that made Jeremiah's eyes narrow. In the event of the death of Thomas Donnelly before full repayment of this debt, it read, all outstanding amounts shall become immediately due and payable within 60 days, or in lieu of full payment. The undersigned agrees that the entire property described in the attached survey, being the Donnelly Ranch located in Carbon County, Wyoming Territory, shall pass to Creed Hollies or his designated representative in full satisfaction of the debt. Thomas had been dead for 10 days. They had 50 days left. He knew my father was sick, Caroline said from behind him, her voice flat and cold with contained anger. I believe he structured those terms intentionally, knowing that my father's health was failing and that this clause would eventually be triggered. Jeremiah set the document on the desk. Have you spoken to Hollies yet? Yesterday morning. He was civil and completely immovable. He said he had partners in the property deal, investors from back east who are counting on the acquisition. He said he was sorry for my loss, but that business was business. She paused. He also said that there might be another arrangement available, something outside the terms of the document, but he did not specify what it was, and I did not ask because I did not trust what the answer would be. Jeremiah's expression went hard and still in the way that indicated a particular kind of anger that he had learned over years to keep very controlled. He is not going to make that suggestion to you again, he said quietly. Jeremiah, I am not going to threaten him, he said, because he could see what she was thinking. I am going to consult a lawyer. Laramie has lawyers. And I am going to look very carefully at that interest rate, because if it exceeds what is legally permissible under Wyoming Territory law, which I believe it does, then his entire claim may be contestable. She stared at him. I didn't think of that. You have been dealing with grief and travel and the business of getting here. I have had 2 days on horseback to think about nothing else. He turned to face her fully, and something in his expression softened. You are not in this alone anymore. I need you to understand that, not just for the ranch, for all of it. She looked at him for a long, searching moment, and he could see her deciding something, could see the specific process of a woman who has been managing everything by herself for so long that accepting help feels like a risk she has to consciously choose to take. All right, she said at last. Then let's find a lawyer. The morning arrived gray and cold, the sky sealed over with high autumn cloud cover, and Jeremiah was down in the hotel dining room when Caroline came downstairs, dressed in a dark blue traveling dress with her hair properly pinned, and an expression of determined composure that he recognized as her armor. He had coffee waiting for her and a plate of eggs and toast, and she sat down across from him and ate with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that today is a day for practical action rather than feeling. They found the lawyer 2 blocks from the hotel, a man named Gerald Pruitt who had an office above a dry goods store and a reputation, according to the hotel clerk's unasked-for assessment, as the most knowledgeable property law attorney in Laramie County. Pruitt was a compact, precise man in his early 50s with a quality of complete attention that immediately inspired confidence. He read the Donnelly Hollies loan document from beginning to end twice without speaking, his expression professionally neutral, and then he set it on his desk and looked at both of them over the top of his spectacles. The interest rate, he said, is 31% compounded annually. Is that legal? Jeremiah asked. The Wyoming Territory Legislature passed a usury statute in 1876. Legal maximum interest rate on private loans is 18% per year. Pruitt removed his spectacles and held them loosely in one hand. This contract, as written, charges a rate that has been illegal under territorial law for the entire duration of the loan, which means every dollar of interest Mr. Hollis has added since June 1878 is void. Caroline's breath went out of her slowly. What does that mean practically? It means that the outstanding debt, properly calculated at the legal rate, is approximately $2,300, not $4,600. It also means, and this is the more significant point, that a court would very likely find the secondary default clause unenforceable, because it was attached to a contract that was itself in violation of territorial law at the time of signing. He paused. Mr. Hollis either did not know about the usury statute, which seems unlikely for a man who was apparently sophisticated enough to structure this contract deliberately, or he knew and gambled that the Donnelly family would never hire a lawyer. He gambled wrong, Jeremiah said. So it appears. Pruitt replaced his spectacles. I would recommend a formal legal challenge to the outstanding amount. In the meantime, I can draft a letter to Mr. Hollis informing him of the territorial statute and the irregularity of his claim. In my experience, men like Mr. Hollis become significantly more flexible when they understand that their legal position is weaker than they believed. Caroline reached into her bag and produced her coin purse. What is your fee? $25 for the initial consultation and the letter. If it proceeds to a formal court challenge, we can discuss additional fees at that point. I suspect it will not proceed that far. Jeremiah was already reaching into his coat. I'll cover it. Caroline turned to look at him with an expression that was partly argument and partly something warmer, and he met her eyes with a quiet steadiness that said, simply, that this was not a negotiation. After a moment, she let him. They left Pruitt's office with a copy of his letter to be delivered to Creed Hollis that afternoon, and they stood for a moment on the wooden boardwalk outside, while the cold morning air moved around them carrying the smell of coal smoke and river mud, and Caroline looked at Jeremiah with an expression that was so open and unguarded that he felt the breath leave his body a little. I have been running this ranch in my head since I was 12 years old, she said. I have been watching my father make the decisions and learning from every single one of them, the good ones and the bad ones, and I always told myself that when the time came I would be ready, that I would not need anyone to ride in and rescue me. She paused. I was not expecting this to feel less like rescue and more like, I am not quite sure what word to use. Partnership, he offered. Yes, she said. That. They stood there on the boardwalk in the gray morning air, and the distance between them was approximately 2 feet, and both of them were very aware of it. Then she smiled, a small, private smile that she directed at the middle distance rather than at him, and said, "Come on. Let's go back to the hotel and wait for Mr. Hollis to respond." Creed Hollis responded with remarkable speed, which confirmed Jeremiah's theory that the man had known exactly how legally precarious his position was. By mid-afternoon, a message was delivered to the hotel asking if Miss Donnelly and her representative would be willing to meet with Mr. Hollis at his office to discuss revised terms. The language was careful and formal, and notably stripped of the breezy confidence that Caroline had described from their first meeting. They met him at 4 o'clock. His office was on the top floor of a brick building near the railroad depot, well appointed in the way that men who build their wealth on other people's desperation tend to appoint their offices. Hollis himself was in his mid-50s, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had once been handsome, and had settled into something more calculated. He greeted them with the particular warmth of a man who is in the process of significantly revising his strategy. Jeremiah sat next to Caroline across the desk from Hollis and watched the negotiation with focused attention, not intervening except when Hollis twice attempted subtle misdirection about the exact legal language of Pruitt's letter. Both times, Jeremiah corrected him quietly and without drama, and both times Holly's adjusted without pushing back, which told Jeremiah that the lawyer's assessment had been correct. The final agreed terms were these. The outstanding debt was recalculated at the legal interest rate, bringing the total to $2,280. Caroline would have 90 days to produce this amount, rather than the 50 originally triggered by Thomas's death. Holly's agreed in writing to accept this as full and final settlement, with no claim on the land or any other assets of the Donnelly Ranch. Prout would draft the revised agreement the following morning. When they stepped back out onto the street, the sun had broken through the cloud cover for the first time all day, falling across the wooden storefronts and the dusty street in long, warm, late afternoon slabs of gold. Caroline stopped on the boardwalk and tilted her face up to it for a moment with her eyes closed, just breathing, and then she opened her eyes and looked at Jeremiah with an expression of such relief and gratitude, and something else that he could not name except that it made his heart do something complicated. "We need to celebrate," she said. "I know a place that serves a reasonable steak," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, the first he had heard from her in days, and the sound of it undid something in him completely. They ate dinner at a restaurant on the main street, a proper table with a white cloth and real silverware, and a menu that had been hand-lettered on a chalkboard by someone with genuine penmanship ambitions. They ordered steaks and fried potatoes and coffee, and then, on an extravagance that felt entirely justified given the circumstances, a slice each of a dried apple pie that the waitress described with the reverence of someone who had been recommending it all day and had not yet been wrong. Over dinner, they talked in a way they had never quite talked before. Not about the ranch or the cattle or the weather or the dozen practical concerns that had always defined their conversations at Thomas's table, but about themselves, about the particular histories that had brought each of them to that specific stretch of Wyoming earth. Caroline told him about growing up on the Donnelly Ranch after her mother died of cholera when Caroline was 9. She told him about learning to ride before she could properly read, about the way her father had handled her grief by giving her work to do, not out of cruelty, but out of the conviction that the land was a healer if you were willing to let it be. She told him about the year she had spent in Cheyenne at 15, staying with her father's sister to receive the kind of formal education that the ranch couldn't provide, and how she had been grateful for it and desperate to come home in roughly equal measure the entire time. Jeremiah listened with the full, still attention that she had noticed in him before, but that felt different now, in this context, directed at her in this way. Then she asked him, and he told her. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers, on a farm that was large enough to survive but not large enough to support 4 grown men, and their ambitions simultaneously. He told her about coming west at 18 with $40 and a horse that wasn't entirely his, about the years of drifting between cattle outfits and ranch work, and the occasional stretch of winter spent in one town or another doing whatever paid. He told her about the cattle drive where he had first come through the Redemption Creek territory and thought, "This is the land I was looking for." And then he told her about the day 2 years ago when he had ridden up to the Donnelly Ranch asking about work, and Thomas Donnelly had looked at him for about 30 seconds and then said, simply, "You look like a man who knows how to stay put when he finds the right place. Can you stay put?" Caroline smiled at this. "He never told me that. He just told me he'd hired a new hand. He told me about you that day. He said he had a daughter who ran half the ranch already and didn't always appreciate people implying she needed help, and that if I had any sense I would figure that out quickly and work with her rather than around her." She looked at him across the table, and the candlelight was doing something to the color of her eyes that he was going to be thinking about for a long time. "And did you figure it out quickly?" "Not immediately," he admitted. "I believe we argued about the rotation schedule for the East pasture cattle within my first week." "You were wrong about it," she said, without heat. "I was wrong about it," he agreed, "and you told me so with very little ceremony, and I thought, this woman is going to be a significant presence in my life. That is a very diplomatic way to describe it. I was trying to be charming." She looked at him for a moment with her chin slightly lifted and that expression in her eyes that was equal parts amusement and something more serious, and then she said, "You are considerably better at it than you think you are." He felt warmth move through him that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Caroline," he said, "when we get back to Redemption Creek, I would like to court you properly. If that is something you would welcome." She did not look away. "It is something I have been hoping for long enough that I was beginning to think I had imagined the possibility." "You did not imagine it." "Good," she said simply. They walked back to the hotel through the cool September night with the stars breaking out overhead in vast, indifferent quantities, and at the foot of the staircase they stopped and stood facing each other in the narrow lamplight of the lobby. "Good night, Jeremiah," she said. "Good night, Caroline." She went up the stairs. He watched her go, and when she had turned the corner at the top of the landing, he stood there for a moment with the specific happiness of a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told that the road ahead is considerably more navigable than he thought. Then he went upstairs too and fell asleep easily for the first time in weeks. In the morning they signed the revised agreement in Pruett's office, paid the lawyer his fee, and shook hands all around. Pruitt told them, with the professional satisfaction of a man who genuinely enjoyed winning, that he would hold the signed documents in his files as security. Hollies, he said, would not be troubling the Donnelly ranch further. They rode out of Laramie together just before noon. The ride back to Redemption Creek took 3 days because they were not pushing the horses, and because there was no longer any urgency driving them, only the steady pull of home and the gradual, unhurried business of two people learning each other in a new way. They camped at the creek crossing on the first night, as Jeremiah had on his way out, and this time there were 2 fires worth of warmth and 2 cups of coffee, and a conversation that ran from the practical, how to raise the $2,000 owed to Hollies in 90 days, to the deeply personal, what each of them wanted from a life on that particular stretch of land. Caroline had clear, specific ideas about the ranch's future. She wanted to expand the cattle operation, but selectively, focusing on quality over volume. She wanted to develop the water rights on the southern property line that Thomas had never gotten around to formalizing. She wanted to build a proper schoolhouse in Redemption Creek, because the nearest school was 12 miles distant, and 3 families on neighboring properties had children who were growing up without formal education. This last ambition surprised Jeremiah slightly, not because it was impractical but because it was bigger than the ranch, because it reached outward into the community in a way that spoke to a woman who thought of her responsibilities as extending well beyond her own fence lines. He told her he thought it was a fine idea. He told her about the school he had briefly attended in Missouri, 1 room and 1 teacher and 17 children of varying ages and ability levels, and how the teacher, a young woman barely older than her oldest students, had managed the whole enterprise with a combination of genuine dedication and cheerful intolerance of nonsense that he had admired his entire adult life. "What was her name?" Caroline asked. "Miss Hartley. She married a farmer the year I left, and I heard afterward she gave up teaching, which I always thought was a loss for all the children who came after." He paused. "Women who are good at things they love should be allowed to keep doing them." Caroline was quiet for a moment. The fire between them had settled to a steady burn, throwing warm orange light across the dry grass and the dark shapes of their hobbled horses beyond. "My father used to say," she said slowly, "that the hardest thing about this country was figuring out which of your limitations were real and which ones other people had simply convinced you to accept." She looked across the fire at him. "I think that is the truest thing he ever said. He was a wise man. He was." Her voice was tender and sad and composed all at once. "I miss him already in the way you miss something you always knew was going to be gone someday, but that you never quite believed in. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense. She looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched one of the smooth stones at the edge of the fire ring, absently, the way people touch things when they are thinking about something else. I am glad he knew you, she said. I am glad he had you with him at the end. He told me to look after you, Jeremiah said. Those were almost his exact last words. He said, look after my Caroline, and he said it the way you say something that matters to you more than almost anything else, and I told him I would. He paused. I meant it. I mean it now in a different way than I meant it then, but I mean it just as completely. She looked at him across the fire with an expression that was so open it almost hurt to look at directly, and then she said very quietly, You do not need his permission to love me, Jeremiah, in case you were wondering. The word between them, the specific chosen word, hung in the warm air above the fire, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then Jeremiah said, I know. I just wanted you to know that I take it seriously. All of it. You, the ranch, the life we would be building. I am not a man who does things halfway. No, she agreed. You are very much not. He looked at her steadily across the fire, this woman who had ridden 130 miles alone to fight for her father's land, who had left a candle burning in her window as an act of faith and love, who had written him a letter she wasn't sure she should have written, who was now sitting across a campfire in the Wyoming dark telling him he did not need permission to love her. Caroline, he said. Yes. May I come sit beside you? She moved to make room for him on the flat rock she was sitting on, and he crossed the fire and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they sat together in the easy, rightful warmth of two people who have been moving toward each other for a long time and have finally closed the last of the distance. He did not kiss her that night. It was not the right moment, not the right setting, not the right sequence of things. But he took her hand, carefully, and she let him, and they sat together looking at the fire until it burned down to coals, and then they said good night and went to their separate bedding rolls. And in the morning when they woke and saddled the horses and resumed the road, there was something between them that had shifted permanently and beautifully and without any drama at all. They arrived back at the Donnelly Ranch on the third evening, riding in from the east as the sun went down behind the western ridge, and the light went red and gold over the whole landscape. The ranch house stood against the darkening sky exactly as it always had, solid and real and particular, with the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney that meant Margaret had been there and would have left something on the stove, and the horses moving in the corral, and the familiar smell of the place hitting them both as they came through the gate. And in the second-floor window, the small, steady flame of a candle. Margaret was standing on the porch, and she looked at them coming in across the yard, and her face did something that was almost a smile, which was as close to an expression of emotion as Margaret ever got. She looked at the two of them, at the way they were riding side by side with a closeness that was not quite touching, but was clearly different from the way they had ridden out of this yard separately 2 and 3 weeks ago respectively, and she nodded once with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting on a conclusion that she calculated approximately 18 months ago. Dinner's on the stove, she said. Stew. And there's cornbread. Thank you, Margaret, Caroline said. She dismounted and handed the reins to one of the hired hands who had come out at the sound of their arrival, and then she walked up the porch steps and paused next to Margaret and put her hand briefly on the older woman's arm, and Margaret covered it with her own hand for a moment, and something passed between them that was private and complete. Then Caroline went inside, and Jeremiah put the horses away himself because he wanted a few minutes alone with the physical work of something simple and honest. And when he came out of the stable and looked up at the house, he could see through the kitchen window the warm lamplight and the silhouette of Caroline moving inside, and it looked exactly like what it was, which was home. The weeks that followed were some of the best of Jeremiah Hawkins's life, and he recognized that fact even as he was living inside it, which is a rare ability that most people only develop with hindsight. The ranch in autumn had a different quality than the ranch in summer, quieter and more concentrated, the pace of work shifting from the sustained intensity of calving season and summer grazing into the careful, methodical preparation for winter. They worked alongside each other every day, Jeremiah and Caroline, the way they always had, except that now the working was laced through with a new awareness, a new register of attention that made familiar tasks feel slightly charged with something additional. They argued less and agreed more, not because they had become agreeable, but because the arguments that had always partly been about proximity and feeling and things neither of them had been saying directly were no longer necessary now that the direct thing had been said. On a Saturday afternoon in early October, with the first hard frost of the season turning the grass silver and the sky a sharp, clear blue that felt like a promise, Jeremiah brought Caroline a cup of coffee to where she was working at the account books at the kitchen table, and when she looked up to take it, he leaned down and kissed her for the first time. It was brief and very deliberate, and carried the full weight of everything that had been building toward it, and when he straightened up, she looked at him with her dark eyes and said, in a voice that was perfectly level but slightly softer than usual, "I have been waiting for that for a considerable time." "Was it worth the wait?" he asked, in the manner of someone who is reasonably confident of the answer but wants to hear it anyway. "Ask me again in a year," she said, and turned back to her account books, but she was smiling, and the smile stayed on her face for the rest of the afternoon. The question of the $2,280 owed to Holly's was not abstract. It was a real and pressing concern, and they addressed it with the focused practicality of two people who take financial reality seriously. Over the course of several evenings at the kitchen table, they went through Thomas's accounts and the current state of the herd and the market prices in Cheyenne, and laid out a clear picture of what was possible. The fall cattle sale would bring in approximately $1,400 after costs. The remaining $880 was, frankly, a challenge. But Caroline had something her father had not. She had information about the water rights situation on the southern property line that suggested there might be a buyer for a small section of non-essential grazing land, a strip along the creek that the neighboring Patterson family had been wanting access to for years. She wrote to the Pattersons, and within 2 weeks had a written offer of $950 for the creek strip, which more than covered the remainder. They paid Creed Holly's in full on a cold November morning, delivering a bank draft to his Laramie office via a courier service, along with a signed receipt form prepared by Prout. Holly signed it without comment. Prout sent word that the matter was legally closed, and the Donnelly ranch was free and clear of all encumbrances. Caroline read Prout's letter standing in the kitchen with her coffee, and then she set it down on the table and said, simply, "Good." Jeremiah, who was watching her face from across the room, thought that the relief and satisfaction in her expression were two of the finest things he had ever seen. He also knew, by this point, that he was going to ask her to marry him, and that he intended to do it correctly, not in a kitchen in November, but in a way that matched the weight and seriousness of what he was asking, and he spent a considerable portion of the next 3 weeks quietly planning toward this end. He rode into Redemption Creek on a Tuesday in late November and went to see the preacher, not to discuss marriage yet, but to ask a question he had been carrying for some time. He asked whether Thomas Donnelly in his last days had said anything about Caroline, about his hopes for her future, about anyone in particular. The preacher, a quiet, thoughtful man named Reverend Albright, who had shepherded the Redemption Creek congregation for 15 years and kept confidences with a professional thoroughness, considered the question and then said, carefully, "Thomas spoke of you, Mr. Hawkins. He said that he had hoped things would go a certain way between you and his daughter, and that his one regret about his timing was that he would not be there to see it. He also said he considered you to be the kind of man that a father could die in peace knowing was in his daughter's life." Jeremiah sat with this for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "It is a privilege," said the Reverend, "to be able to pass that on." On a Saturday afternoon in late November, with the first light snow of the season fallen overnight, and the ranch world transformed to white and silver and gray, Jeremiah asked Caroline to walk out to the back of the property with him on the pretext of checking a fence line that had been reported as loose along the eastern edge. She put on her coat and her boots and her hat and came with him without suspicion, because checking fence lines was a completely ordinary thing, and she had no reason to expect anything other than a fence line. He took her to the highest point of the property, a gentle rise in the east pasture from which you could see the whole ranch spread out below, the house and the barns and the corral, and the creek glittering in its winter ice. And beyond all of that, the long roll of the Wyoming plains going out to the horizon in every direction, vast and beautiful and completely without mercy or sentiment, which was exactly what made the human things built against that backdrop so significant. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and she looked at him with the beginning of something slightly different in her expression, the first suspicion that this was not entirely about a fence line. "Caroline," he said. "Yes," she said, watching him carefully. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced the ring he had purchased in Redemption Creek from the only jeweler in town, a plain gold band with a small single garnet set in it, because garnet was the color of the red Wyoming earth, and it seemed right. He held it between his fingers and looked at her directly with all of the accumulated feeling of 2 years and 130 miles, and 100 small moments of love that he had been carrying quietly for too long. "I know this land as well as I know anything," he said. "I know the way the light changes over those ridges in the afternoon, and the way the creek smells after rain, and the way the sky gets before a storm that means business. I know all of that. And I know you the same way, with the same kind of certainty that comes from paying close attention over a long time. I know that you are the bravest person I have ever met, and that you have never asked for anything you weren't willing to work for, and that you love this land and the people on it with the kind of love that holds things together." He paused. "I want to hold things together with you. I want to build a life on this ranch with you that is as real and lasting as the land itself. I want to be your partner in all the ways there are to be a partner to someone." He held the ring out to her. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring and then she looked at him, and her dark eyes were very bright in the cold air, and there was a moment of perfect, suspended stillness in which the only things that existed were the two of them on this rise in the Wyoming snow with the whole world spread out around them. Then she said, "Yes, Jeremiah, absolutely and without any reservation whatsoever, yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked up at him, and he kissed her there on the rise in the east pasture with the cold wind coming from the north and the snow bright and clean all around them. And it was nothing like their first brief kitchen doorway kiss, and everything like every kiss that should come after it, warm and certain and deeply, quietly joyful. When they walked back down to the ranch house, Margaret was in the kitchen and she looked at them, and she looked at Caroline's left hand, and she set down the pan she was holding and pressed both her hands together in front of her with a satisfied expression that Jeremiah had never seen on her face before and suspected she produced infrequently. "Finally," she said. "Margaret," Caroline said, laughing. "I have been waiting 2 years," Margaret said. "I am allowed to say finally." The wedding was planned for March, which gave them the winter to prepare and gave Caroline the time she felt she needed to be properly through the first season of her father's absence before beginning this new chapter. Jeremiah thought this showed both wisdom and emotional intelligence and said so, and Caroline looked at him with an expression of mild surprise that was almost funny. "You are quite good at saying the right thing," she observed. "I have been practicing," he said. They spent the winter working and planning and courting in the comfortable, daily, domestic way that people who already live and work together, and have spent 2 years building a foundation of genuine respect and partnership tend to court, which is to say with a great deal of conversation and laughter, and the occasional argument, and a steadily deepening sense that this was exactly right, that this was the specific shape of the future they had each been moving toward without quite knowing it. Sela's web came by the ranch in December, which Jeremiah had expected and had prepared for. He came on a Tuesday morning, riding in from the road with the easy, proprietary manner of a man who has not yet received the information that the situation has changed materially against his interests. He asked to speak with Caroline. Caroline came out onto the porch, and Jeremiah stood behind her and slightly to the left, not threateningly but unmistakably. Sela's web looked at Jeremiah with a careful, assessing expression, and then looked at the ring on Caroline's left hand, which was not difficult to miss since she was not concealing it. He took this in with the composure of a man who has made and lost several different plays in his life and knows how to absorb a loss without showing it completely. "I see," he said. "The Donnelly Ranch is in good order," Caroline said, "and all its business matters are resolved. If you have something specific to discuss regarding the property line along the north section that we share, I'm happy to schedule a proper meeting. Otherwise, I believe we have said everything that needs to be said." Sela's web nodded, once, the small, precise nod of a man conceding a game he now understands he has lost. He turned his horse and rode back out through the gate, and Jeremiah watched him go until he was a small figure on the road and then smaller still and then gone. "Will he cause trouble?" Jeremiah asked. "Not if he's sensible," Caroline said, "and I think on balance Sela's is sensible." She turned and went back inside. "I'll put the coffee on." He was never heard from as a problem again. December and January and February passed in the way that Wyoming winters pass, with a combination of brutal cold and unexpected beauty, the kind of weather that requires genuine cooperation between people sharing a space and a life. They were genuinely good at cooperating, it turned out. Better than either of them had quite realized, while the cooperation had been purely professional. They talked endlessly, in the long evenings by the fire, about everything from the practical expansion plans for the ranch to the books they had each read and the places they had each been, and the things they believed about how a person ought to live. Jeremiah was not a man who talked about himself readily, but with Caroline, he found that the words came without the usual effort, because she listened with complete attention and never used anything he told her as ammunition or leverage, only as information about who he was, which she seemed to receive with genuine and uncomplicated interest. He told her things he had never told anyone. About the year in his early 20s, when he had taken a job with an outfit that he later discovered was driving stolen cattle, and the specific, nauseating horror of realizing that he had been made a participant in theft through ignorance, and the fact that he had turned the information over to a territorial marshal and lost the job and spent the next 6 months certain he was going to be either arrested or shot. He told her about the woman in Kansas City who he had thought, briefly, might be the person he was supposed to build a life with, and how that had ended badly for reasons that were partly his fault and partly a fundamental mismatch that they had both been too stubborn to acknowledge until it was past the point of kindness. He told her about the loneliness of the years of moving, the specific kind of loneliness that is not about being alone, but about being in one place while belonging to another that you haven't found yet. Caroline listened to all of it. She asked specific, intelligent questions that indicated she had been paying close attention. And then she told him her own version of equivalent stories, with the kind of trust that says, "You have given me something real and I will give you the same." By the time February ended and March arrived with its particular quality of incipient thaw, the last cold before the grudging concession of spring, they had built something between them in those winter evenings that was more solid and deeply founded than most things people build in a lifetime. They knew each other. Not perfectly, because nobody knows another person perfectly, but truly, which is better. The wedding was on a Saturday in late March, a clear cold day with a wind that smelled of coming spring, and the sky, a hard clean blue above the Wyoming plains. Reverend Albright performed the ceremony in the Redemption Creek Church, which was full, because Caroline Donnelly was someone the people of the town knew and respected and were pleased to see happy, and because Jeremiah Hawkins had been working the county for 2 years and had a reputation as a man of solid character, who was also not difficult to talk to, which is a combination that tends to generate goodwill. Margaret cried during the ceremony, silently and without any acknowledgement of doing so, and flatly denied it afterward. Caroline wore a dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in Cheyenne, deep blue silk with white trim at the collar and cuffs, and she walked into that church with her chin lifted, and her eyes clear, and an expression of such contained, particular happiness that Jeremiah, standing at the front waiting for her, lost track of the next 2 or 3 seconds entirely, and then found them again when she was standing beside him and looking up at him with a smile that was entirely private and entirely for him. He thought, "This is the best day of my life so far." He then thought, so far. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Donnelly Ranch that more than half the town appeared to attend, with food that Margaret had organized with her characteristic efficient authority, and delegated to a small army of neighboring women who had arrived that morning prepared to execute her plan without deviation. There was a fiddle player and a caller and dancing in the cleared barn, and the fire burned high, and there was cider and coffee and a great deal of food. And in the middle of all of it, at one particular moment, Jeremiah found himself standing at the edge of the barn door with a cup of cider looking at Caroline across the room as she talked to the Reverend's wife, laughing at something, her head tilted back and her eyes bright, and he felt the specific, devastating happiness of a man who has gotten exactly what he wanted and knows it. She looked across the room and found him looking at her, and the expression that passed between them, brief and warm and entirely communicative, was the kind of thing that requires no words at all. The spring came in hard and full, the way Wyoming springs do, with mud and flooding and the urgent business of calving season, and they went into it together, working from before dawn to after dark, side by side, with the comfortable, confident rhythm of 2 people who know each other's strengths and cover each other's gaps without keeping score. The ranch was theirs now, jointly and completely, and the sense of shared ownership gave their work a quality of investment that was different from anything Jeremiah had felt in the years of working other people's land. He also began, quietly, to make the case for the schoolhouse that Caroline had mentioned on their ride back from Laramie. He talked to the neighboring families, the Pattersons and the Garfields and the Wrenches and the Henrys, all of whom had children who were either untaught or taught inadequately at home, and he found that the interest was there, that the people of that community were hungry for something they had not known how to organize on their own. He talked to the county authorities in Cheyenne and discovered that there was a territorial education fund that provided a small stipend to established community schools. He hired a surveyor to identify the best location for a building on a plot of public land between the Donnelly Ranch and the Patterson property. Caroline came home one evening in May to find a rolled survey map spread out on the kitchen table and Jeremiah standing over it with a compass and a pencil, and she looked at the map and then at him with an expression of such complete, bright surprise that he felt immediately pleased with himself. "The schoolhouse," she said. "I thought I would move it forward," he said. She crossed to the table and looked at the survey map closely, her finger tracing the outlined building plot and the road access and the creek access for water. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "This is exactly right. This is exactly where I would have put it." "I know," he said. "You told me on the road from Laramie." She turned and looked at him with an expression that was warm and exact and quietly overwhelmed. "You remembered. I remember everything you tell me." She put both hands on his face and kissed him with a feeling and directness that told him, clearly and without any ambiguity at all, that she intended to spend a very long time making sure he understood how much that meant to her. The summer brought growth in all the forms that word suggests. The calving had gone well, and the herd was expanding with a quality and constitution that began to attract notice from buyers who came through in July. The price they got at the summer sale was the best in 3 years, enough to fund both the first phase of the schoolhouse construction and the water rights development on the southern property line, both of which Jeremiah had been quietly planning since the previous winter. Caroline was also expecting their first child by July, which she told Jeremiah in the kitchen one morning with the direct, matter-of-fact composure of someone announcing something enormous without quite being able to summon a commensurate scale of expression for it. So she was simply telling him and trusting him to understand. He understood. He understood so completely that he stood perfectly still for approximately 5 seconds and then crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her face in both hands with a gentleness that was at complete odds with everything he had been doing before that moment, which was sharpening a fence post. "Are you well?" he asked first and immediately. "I am perfectly well," she said. "More than well." The child arrived in late February of the following year, 1884, a boy, born in the bedroom that had been Thomas Donnelly's, with Margaret and the doctor from Redemption Creek both present. He was healthy and loud and had Caroline's dark coloring, and, in Jeremiah's biased but firmly held opinion, an expression of fundamental intelligence visible from the first hour of his existence. They named him Thomas Jeremiah Hawkins. Margaret held him before she allowed herself to cry, which she again denied doing. Caroline lay in the bed afterward with the easy, exhausted satisfaction of someone who has done something very hard and very worthwhile, and she looked at Jeremiah sitting beside the bed with his son in his arms, and the expression on his face, that specific combination of terror and adoration that first-time fathers produce, and which is universal across all eras and all landscapes, and she felt something settle in her that had been, perhaps, the last small restless thing. Everything her father had hoped for her, and more. She thought of him in that moment with love and grief and gratitude in roughly equal measure, and she looked up at the ceiling and said, very quietly, just for herself and for him, that she was all right, that she was more than all right, that he could rest easy. In her window, the candle burned. Not as a signal of absence now, not as the faithful flame of a daughter keeping her promise across the distance of road and days, but simply as a habit of the heart, a small act of continuity that had become, over the years, its own kind of prayer. She lit it every night before bed and let it burn for an hour, and Jeremiah, who understood what it meant and why she did it, never once suggested she stop. The schoolhouse opened in September of 1884, 12 children on its first day, taught by a young woman named Miss Eliza Clare, who had come from Cheyenne with a teaching certificate and considerable determination, and who managed the mixed-age classroom with a quality of engaged authority that reminded Jeremiah of a teacher he had known in Missouri. The opening day was attended by most of the community, and the Hendersons brought a cake, and the Pattersons brought firewood for the small iron stove, and Reverend Albright said a few appropriate words, and Caroline stood in the back of the room with Thomas on her hip and watched 12 children sit at their new desks and look up at Miss Clare with the particular, alert readiness of young people who understand that something important is about to begin. She reached for Jeremiah's hand without looking at him. He gave it to her without looking at her. They stood together while Miss Clare wrote the alphabet across the top of the blackboard in careful, large letters, the chalk making that particular small scraping sound, and in the front row, a boy named Daniel Patterson, who had never been inside a schoolroom in his 8 years on earth, leaned forward in his seat as though he might fall off the edge of it toward the letters, driven by a gravity that was all his own. Caroline squeezed Jeremiah's hand. He squeezed back. The water rights on the southern property line were formally registered in the county records in October 1884, a piece of legal business that Thomas Donnelly had intended to complete for over a decade, and that his daughter and son-in-law had now completed on his behalf. The access to year-round creek water on that portion of land, increased the property's value substantially. And it also meant that the summer grazing in the south pasture, which had always been restricted by available water, was now considerably more viable. Jeremiah noted, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has planned carefully over a long period, that the Donnelly Ranch was now in a stronger financial and operational position than it had been at any point in Thomas's tenure, which he suspected Thomas would have appreciated, and which he knew Caroline did. She told him as much, one evening in November with the stove burning and Thomas asleep in his crib in the corner and the account books open between them on the kitchen table after going through the year's numbers together. "My father would have been proud of this," she said. "He would have taken full credit for hiring me," Jeremiah said. She laughed. "He absolutely would have." Jeremiah looked at her across the table, this woman who had become so thoroughly the center of his life that he could barely remember the specific shape of the life before her, and he thought about everything she had carried and everything she had built, and the way she did both of those things with a completeness that was one of the most admirable qualities he had ever encountered in another person. "Caroline," he said. She looked up from the account book. "I want you to know," he said, "that I am aware every day of exactly how fortunate I am." She looked at him with an expression that was direct and warm and entirely without artifice. "So am I," she said, "every single day." The years that followed were good years, full and difficult and beautiful in the specific way that a life built on real work and real land and real love tends to be. They had a second child in 1886, a boy again, named John, who was born in summer instead of winter, and had Jeremiah's lighter coloring and Caroline's directness of manner from approximately the moment he could express a preference about anything. By 1887, the Donnelly Hawkins operation, as it had come to be known in the county, was one of the most consistently productive cattle ranches in Carbon County. They had expanded the herd carefully and strategically. They had built a new bunkhouse for the permanent hands. They had improved the road access from the main track to the ranch gate, a project that benefited their three closest neighbors as well, and which they had undertaken collectively. The schoolhouse had grown to 23 students. Miss Eliza Clare had, to the community's great relief, decided to stay, having found Redemption Creek to her liking and its people to be worth her dedication. Caroline served on the school board that the county formalized in 1888. She was the only woman on it, which she treated as a logistical fact rather than a political statement. And she managed the other members, 4 men of varying opinions and degrees of stubbornness, with a diplomatic efficiency that Jeremiah admired enormously and only occasionally teased her about. They had a third child in 1889. A girl this time, who they named Margaret, which caused the original Margaret to claim, with characteristic composure, that it was a fine and sensible name, and to then spend approximately the next 20 minutes of the conversation in a slightly softer and more expansive mood than usual. The infant Margaret grew into a small, serious person with large dark eyes and a quality of observational attention that reminded everyone who met her of her mother, which Caroline received as the compliment it was clearly meant to be. In the spring of 1890, on a clear morning that still carried the last cold of winter in its early hours but promised genuine warmth by afternoon, Jeremiah walked out to the rise in the east pasture, the one he had walked Caroline to when he proposed, and stood there looking out over the whole of the Donnelly Ranch, which was now and would always be the Hawkins Ranch as well, the two names belonging to each other in all the ways that mattered. He could see the house clearly from here, the additions they had built onto it over the years, the kitchen addition and the extra bedroom and the new porch that wrapped around the south and west sides. He could see the barns and the new bunkhouse and the corrals with the horses moving in them. He could see, at the kitchen window, a figure moving, and he knew from the quality of motion and the particular way she held herself when she was working and thinking at the same time that it was Caroline. He stood there for a while in the spring morning with his hands in his pockets, and the wind from the north carrying the green smell of early grass, and the particular clean cold of a Wyoming day that is trying its best to be warm. Behind him, he heard small feet on the still cold ground, and he turned to see Thomas, 6 years old now and entirely purposeful in all his movements, climbing the rise toward him with the focused determination of a child who has spotted his father, and decided that whatever he is doing over there is almost certainly more interesting than whatever was happening back at the house. Thomas arrived at the top of the rise slightly breathless and stood beside him, looking out at the same view. "What are you looking at?" Thomas asked. "The ranch," Jeremiah said. "Our ranch. Our ranch." Thomas looked at it for a moment with the serious, proprietary attention of a small boy who is beginning to understand that some things are not just given but earned, that the land he is standing on has a history, and that history includes him. "Mama says you rode all the way to Laramie to find her," Thomas said, with the conversational non sequitur of childhood. "I did." "Why?" Jeremiah thought about this for a moment, looking out at the ranch in the morning light. "Because she needed someone to, and because I wanted to be that person." Thomas considered this with the thoroughness of someone for whom most things are still being discovered. "Is that why you got married?" "That's part of it." "What's the rest?" Jeremiah looked down at his son, who was looking up at him with his mother's dark eyes and his own particular expression of direct, unadorned curiosity. "Because she is the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said, "and because a life with her in it is worth considerably more than a life without her." Thomas nodded slowly, as though filing this away for later use. "Papa," he said. "Yes. Can we go get breakfast now?" Jeremiah laughed, a real laugh that came up from somewhere deep and warm, and he put his hand on his son's shoulder and turned them both back down the slope toward the house. "Yes," he said. "Let's go get breakfast." They walked down the rise together, the man and the small boy, toward the ranch house with its new porch and its lit kitchen window and the smoke coming from the chimney and the sound, audible now as they came through the yard, of Caroline's voice inside, talking to John, who at 3 had strong opinions about most things and a vocabulary that was only slightly too small to express all of them. Jeremiah pushed open the kitchen door, and the warmth and the smell of coffee and bacon, and something sweet baking came out to meet them, and Caroline looked up from the stove with the particular expression she reserved for mornings, which was warm and slightly private, and directed at him in a way that still, after all the years, made something in his chest do the thing it had been doing since at least that afternoon in the Laramie Hotel when she opened the door and looked at him. "Coffee's ready," she said. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, briefly and completely, and she leaned into it for a moment before returning to whatever was on the stove, and Thomas climbed into his chair at the table, and John immediately began a negotiation about something involving a spoon, and the morning came fully into the kitchen with all its ordinary, irreplaceable weight. That night, as every night before she came to bed, Caroline lit the candle in the bedroom window. She lit it with the long wooden matches from the box on the windowsill, and she watched the flame catch and steady itself against the small movements of the interior air, and she looked at it for a moment with the particular expression she wore for this ritual, which Jeremiah had observed enough times now to know was a private conversation, something between her and her father, and the specific quality of love that does not end because the person is gone. He lay in the bed watching her from across the room and thought about everything that candle had meant. The promise a daughter had made to a father who was trying to protect her by not burdening her. The system she had put in place against the possibility of his absence, the letter to Margaret, the candle arrangement, the careful preparation of a woman who was pragmatic even in her love. The letter she had left for Jeremiah himself, the one that had set everything in motion, the cautious, brave, hope-held open letter that said, "When I come back, I need to ask you something." She had come back. She had asked. He had answered. The candle burned in the window, warm and steady, a small flame against the Wyoming dark, visible from the road and from the yard and from anywhere on the property, holding its light the way faith holds, not loudly, not with drama, but continuously and without fail. Caroline turned from the window and crossed the room and climbed into bed beside him, and he put his arm around her and she settled against his side with the ease of years, and outside the window the flame continued its small, faithful burning. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. The ranch was quiet. The children were asleep. The land outside was cold and vast and beautiful and entirely theirs. The candle burned.